morning and welcome once again. If you'd excuse the indulgence, I'm going to start this morning with a little personal reflection. So it's about 40 years since I was at school, and I know that some of you will find it hard to believe, but it's actually true. And despite the passing of 4 decades, these cold mornings still bring to mind miserable hours on the school playing field. Football in the rain, rugby in the ice and snow, and all of this with the happy prospect of a cold shower afterwards. Happy days. But grim though these lessons could be, the worst days of all were those when the teachers really wanted a day off and sent us on a cross-country run. What a pointless waste of time. All right, I know some of you loved it. For some of you, it was the highlight of your week, but this is my story, okay? So we had to run. There were no prizes for coming first. You just had to get round. You had to finish, or there'd be some sort of punishment, a detention, a demerit point, whatever it was. So we would trudge round. The only aim was to keep going and to finish. And as I've been reflecting on our series on perseverance, it occurred to me that we can view our Christian life in a similar way. A race to be endured until one day we slump over the finish line. We can view the exhortations to persevere as simply calls to survive. And you know, that really isn't how we should be living. We do need to persevere. We will face difficulties and obstacles and setbacks and opposition. And we need to persevere through these, but not just to survive. In contrast to me trudging grudgingly through the mud on a wet November morning, picture Usain Bolt running the 100 metres. I saw him once and I swear he was smiling. He was pushing his body to the very limit of what a human being could do. He was persevering, albeit for a few short seconds, but with a smile on his face. He was going to win, and he knew it. And that is the attitude that I think should be in us too, because we aren't just called to survive. We are called to win. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul asks, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one wins the prize?" Then he says, "Run in such a way as to get the prize." Everyone who competes in games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Run in such a way as to get the prize. Run in such a way as to get the crown that will last forever. It is hard work. Even in this verse, it speaks of the strict training necessary. And the Bible doesn't hold back in telling us of the difficulties that we will face and the need for us to persevere. And we all know something of that from our own experience. But we can run with the mindset of a mere survivor, or we can run with the mindset of a victor. And I believe we need to train ourselves to think like victors. You know, if we have the mindset of mere survival, it has consequences for the way we live. I want to suggest that if we think of ourselves as mere survivors, then we start to look inwards to ourselves. We hold on to what we have. We start to think of ourselves as an embattled minority, and we start to develop a mindset of us and them, with them being all those that we perceive as being in opposition to us. So we get on the defensive, we put up barriers, we harden ourselves. And straight away as we start to think like this, we can see this is so opposite to Jesus. This wasn't his mindset at all. He knew who he was, he knew his destiny, he knew the victory he was going to win, and he was secure. And from this position of security, he reached outwards. There was nothing inward looking about Jesus, no holding back, no defensiveness. He loved his enemies. He reached out to sinners. He befriended the lost and the broken. He endured hardship and even death, and he did it all with joy and with love. He lived the life of a victor. And he wants us to imitate him. This is the mindset we want for ourselves. To be able to be on the front foot, able to take risks, able to reach out, able to love and to care, because we know who we are and we know our destiny and we know the victory that is ours in Jesus. And this is something we want to explore a bit over the coming weeks. Lizzie shared a picture recently about a lighthouse, and it was a picture that had been on my mind as well. I suppose with us being called the beacon, it's bound to happen. So a lighthouse has to be strong, and it has to persevere through the storm. And that's really important, obviously. But it isn't enough on its own. To be useful, a lighthouse has to do more than merely survive the storm. It also has to shine. And when it shines, it does good to those that are caught up in the storm. So we're moving on now from our series on perseverance, and we're turning now to think about how we shine in the middle of the storm, about how we can make a difference right now in the midst of all that is going on around us. How can we be proactive in doing good? How can we live victorious Christian lives? And what do they look like? So we're going to do a series that we've called The Victorious Church. And the first thing I have to say is that when I look at my own Christian life, victory isn't the first word that comes to mind. And it probably isn't the first word I associate with the church either. The truth is we can often feel overwhelmed, embattled, pushed back. Often our lives, both individually and corporately, don't look very victorious. We do suffer what seem to be defeats and setbacks. And sometimes those things are real. Sometimes they happen because of our weakness and our sin. But often they are just apparent. Living victorious Christian lives doesn't mean that everything goes well for us. We can personally suffer even at the point that the victory is being won. Think of the greatest victory in history. It didn't look like a victory at the time. When Jesus suffered and died on the cross, it looked very much like a defeat. Certainly the disciples thought so, the authorities thought so, and presumably Satan thought so too. But they were all wrong. None of them could see God's bigger plan. So they couldn't know that what appeared as a defeat was actually a victory. And so as we think about the victorious church, I think a good place to start is to see something of that bigger picture. Because God, through his word, has revealed something of this picture so we can see something of his plan. And as we hold this in mind, I think we are less likely to be knocked off balance by appearances, by apparent setbacks and defeats. So I thought that today, this morning, and with a nod to Christmas too, which is just now 4 weeks away, we would look at a passage that looks at the bigger picture. So the passage I've chosen is from Isaiah chapter 9. This is a passage which is all about victory. It tells us a little of what the victory looks like, and crucially, it tells us the source of that victory. So let me read you part of that passage. So I'm going to read from verses 1 through to 7. But there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time, he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them a light has shone. You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. For every boot of the tramping warrior in battle tumult and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be on his shoulder. And his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. So verses 6 and 7 are perhaps the ones most familiar to us. For unto us a child is born, to us a child is given. These are verses we read every Christmas, and rightly so. This is a passage that foretells the birth of Jesus. And when we remember this was written 700 years before Jesus came, we see this is an amazing prophecy. But this passage also tells us about what would happen as a result of the birth of this child. It tells us about who this child was and what he would do. This is a passage that speaks of the victory that he would win and the kingdom he would establish. So I just want us to notice a few things from this passage. And the first is that this passage speaks of great reversals. So Isaiah prophesied over many years, none of them good for God's people. He started as the Assyrian Empire was growing in size and strength. He continued through their defeat at the hands of the Assyrians and through the first years of their eventual exile. So these were dark days. And Isaiah was speaking to a specific people at a particular time in history, but at the same time, he was talking to all of us who would subsequently read his words. See, it's interesting that he even uses the terms former times and latter times, quite generalised terms. See, until Jesus comes again, every generation can take these words and they will be relevant, because this is a prophecy that is still in the process of being fulfilled. Some parts of it have been. A child has been born. The victory has been won. Jesus' kingdom has been established. But we haven't yet reached the time when his enemies have been destroyed. So although the light has come, there is still darkness. For now, for a time. And we can see that as we look around. There is still hatred and greed and sickness and hurt and pain. We're still in a world that is broken and spoiled and decaying and dying. But all is not lost. This is a passage of hope. This is a passage that shows us the bigger picture so that we can see the end of the story. And so we don't have to be afraid or downcast. As I say, it's a passage that speaks of reversals. In verse 1, we read of the movement from gloom and contempt to glory. Verse 2, we see the movement of darkness to light. Verse 3 speaks of the movement from anguish to joy. In verse 4, we speak of the movement from oppression to freedom. Maybe you're listening to this today and you're feeling overwhelmed and oppressed, fearful and anxious, hemmed in by the darkness or trapped by circumstances. Well, the first four verses of this passage remind us that God is the God of the reversal, a God who restores, who redeems, who forgives and heals. This is a passage that acknowledges the reality of the darkness, the hurt and the despair, but at the same time speaks to us of the hope that we have. Second then, we have that hope because this passage also speaks of great victory. Verse 3 says, we will rejoice like those who divide the spoil. Dividing the spoil is something that victorious armies did after they had conquered. So the picture here is one of victory. Then verse 4, it's more explicit. For the yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken, as on the day of Midian. The yoke, the staff, the rod of the oppressor have been broken by God. And it goes on to reference the day of Midian. Many of you will remember the story this refers to. Remember Gideon? They were faced with a vast army. The army was described as being like a swarm of locusts, thousands and thousands of them. And Gideon's army, you'll recall, had been reduced to just 300, and yet God gave them the victory. And verse 5 makes clear how total this victory is. Look, it says every boot, every single one, every garment rolled in blood is burned in the fire. See, this isn't just victory, this is a complete destruction of the enemy, so that nothing is left. Now, we aren't there yet. At the moment, the enemy, though defeated, is still lashing out. But the time will come when he will be utterly destroyed. We can look around and see the enemy still at work, whether that's through the misery and death that's been caused by COVID, or whether it's laws and social attitudes that seem to attack the things we hold sacred, or whether it's wars or famines or floods. We see these things, and if we're not careful, we can start to feel defeated. But what we're reminded here is that total victory is coming, and that victory won't be won by the enemy. So let that truth fill you with hope and strength and determination. And then we come to verse 6. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given. So third then, we are given the reason for the hope that we have. For the reason why we have the hope of reversal and victory is because a child is born, a son is given. For Isaiah, this was still 700 years into the future. For us, this has already happened 2,000 years ago. We have the assurance of victory because God didn't stay on the sidelines, but he came. God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son to come right into the world and to live amongst all the brokenness and pain, to suffer and ultimately to die. And through the darkness, death, and apparent defeat of the cross, the God of the great reversal brought life and light and victory. Despair was turned into hope. The day of mourning was turned into a day of dancing. We live in the hope of victory, but not because of what we will do, though we do have a role to play, but we have the hope of victory because what he has already done. It's all about Jesus. And we've got to remember that when we get backed into a corner, when we feel that there's just too much wrong and we can't cope. It's not about us. It's not a burden we have to carry. It's not a burden that we can carry. The government, we are told, will be on his shoulder. He carries it all. And what a great government it is. You're familiar with the verses that describe the governor. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. This is a governor who is wise and strong and caring and brings peace. This is a good person to win the victory and to rule. And his government will continue to increase. When Jesus was here, he said that the kingdom of God is among you. His government has started, but it will continue to grow, and nothing can stop it. There will be no remnant that will remain to spoil it. It will be complete, total, and forever. Like Isaiah, the complete fulfillment of this prophecy is still in the future. But unlike Isaiah, we have seen part of the fulfillment. The Son has been born, and he has won the victory on the cross. His everlasting kingdom has been established and is increasing. The light has shone, and the kingdom of darkness is being pushed back. And though the victory belongs to Jesus, we have a significant part to play. It is through us that his government of peace and righteousness and justice will be administered and will grow. It is through us that God will bring reversals in the lives of people in our community, from death to life, from darkness to light, from oppression to freedom, and from anguish to joy. We're in that period between Jesus' ascension and his return and final victory. And it's in this period that we play out our part in the story. The kingdom of God is here, and it is advancing. God is using us, the church, to push back against the influence of the enemy. He has given us, the church, the victory in Jesus. See, we can make a real difference. We sometimes sing a song, step by step, we're moving forward. Little by little, we're gaining ground. And over these coming weeks, we want to try and think what these steps might be. What are the things we can do to make a difference? What ground can we take? And as we do that, we must remember that we are in a fight. There will be times of difficulty and confusion and hurt. That's what it's like in a war. But we have the amazing advantage of knowing the end result in advance. The outcome is assured. And how can we be sure? At the end of our passage we were told, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish it. This is God's plan. God himself is bringing his kingdom. It will happen. It is assured. And so, with that in mind, let's not just seek to survive, but let's run to win.